Here we are at the 2016 Pasadena Antiquarian Book Fair, sponsored by the ABAA and the Southern California chapter. And we're interviewing right now Mr. Ben Kinmont. Ben, good to have you with us. As I do with all the interviews, give us a background. What were your parents? What did your parents do? Did they have education? Do you have siblings? Did you go to college? Take us up through probably up to your teen years, if you can remember that far back.
Sure. So let's see. My father is an artist. Went to graduate school. I was an art professor while I was growing up, primarily in California. My mother was a photographer and a housewife. And so I grew up in a household where books were certainly around, TV was not allowed, and we were encouraged to read, but there were no collectors in the family. When I was very young, I was probably in first grade, second grade. My mother's brother, my Uncle Dan, gave me a very beaten copy of a kind of popular edition of Robinson Crusoe. And I valued it immensely. I was a natural-born collector. I collected all kinds of things as a child. One of the strangest of which was I had a collection of heavy things when I was in kindergarten and first grade, which I didn't know at the time. It actually meant things that were dense, so I had lots of pieces of lead and steel and things like this until we moved to Canada. My father got his first teaching job at Ontario College of Arts, and the collection was too heavy to take with us. But I've always had something that I collected. And then really the bibliophilic interest didn't really emerge until later I started reading pretty voraciously in middle school. I was never without a book. And then it sort of was pretty dormant other than buying books for studying until I was in college. And I studied American Culture Studies at Pomona College here in Southern California in Claremont. And at one point, I had the opportunity to go to Oxford, and I studied mid-17th century English radical literature at the Bodleian Library. And I was working with this one tutor in particular who was from the literature department, and he was looking at radical political thought as literature, the pamphleteering in the late 40s, early 50s. And because I was at the Bodleian, it was my first experience of actually being able to call up anything I wanted and handle this early material. And it just blew my mind. It was just an amazing experience for me. I think I spent 2 months just ordering things, calling things up to read in Duke Humphrey's room or in the camera, just because I could. It had nothing to do with what I was
What's the
studying.
year?
So this would be 1984.
Okay.
And then I sort of forgot about it to some degree, and then I graduated from Pomona. I got a fellowship to go to Europe to study for a year, to do research in contemporary German art. And then I was either going to go back to Oxford to get another degree, or I was going to move to New York. And my wife's family got off the boat and never left New York. And so she hadn't been around her grandparents for a while, and it was clear that I had to make a choice between Oxford or my girlfriend. She was my girlfriend then, and I was sure about her and not as positive about Oxford. Also, as an American student, it was very expensive to go, so I went to New York, and one day I was walking on Broadway in the Upper West Side, past Griffin Books, I think it was called, and it's no longer there, and in the upper room, they had a rare book room, and I came across one of the pamphlets that I had studied at Oxford, and I was just totally surprised that I could afford it. It was something like $175 or something. And so I started to buy pamphlets and broadsides in the field that I'd studied, and I became a customer of Steve Weissman at Ximenes, a great bookseller who was very useful and helpful for me. And at one point, and I was an artist at this point in New York as well, and exhibiting, and had two galleries that represented me. And So now I'm talking about 1987, 88. And then I was interested in learning more about rare books, but I didn't want to go to library science school. And so I asked Steve about, is it possible to get like a job working for an antiquarian bookseller? Jonathan Hill had just lost his assistant
Yeah.
the week before, and Steve knew about it, and Steve put me in touch with Jonathan. And so my my father-in-law's long-term partner girlfriend is a woman named Jane Lurie. And Jane Lurie is the daughter of Helmut Friedlander. So Helmut Friedlander was a very important collector in New York, former president of the Agoria Club and so on. And Helmut was my reference for Jonathan, and I started working for Jonathan. And the average assistant working for Jonathan only lasted a year or two. And somehow I was there for 10 years.
Wow.
And we got along beautifully. He's very demanding, but he's more gruff on the outside, I would say, than he really is. He's actually a really kind person.
He is.
Was a wonderful mentor to me, and we're still in good touch, in close contact and in touch with each other. And so I worked for Jonathan. Basically, I was responsible for koshering all the books that came in. I collated everything. I went to rare book school. And then so they would come in, and I would check them out to make sure they were complete, what they purported to be, before Jonathan paid for them. But I never got to write descriptions. He always wanted to do the description writing himself. And then, so now I'm talking about roughly 1996 or so, he said to me, if you ever wanted to go into this business, I think you'd be good at it. And he doesn't give out compliments like this very often. And I was like, really? And I, of course, I thought about it sort of, but not really. And so I really started to think about it. And then, I don't come from money, so it took me a long time to save enough money to buy a reference library and inventory. And so I did that over a period of about 2 years for my first catalog. And then I finally went out on my own. And I chose the subject gastronomy partly because for the early printed books, for the 15th, 16th, and early 17th century books, in my field are usually written by doctors. So some of the bibliographies and the reference works that I knew from working with Jonathan with medicine and science, I was able to utilize that knowledge base in dealing with early gastronomy. And I looked at colleagues who had left their mentors and how that had gone, and it seemed that they either burned their bridges and went into competition with who they'd studied with, or they somehow worked it out. And I very much wanted to and needed to be able to work it out with Jonathan. So I just made it very clear if there was ever a book that he would be interested in the auction room as well as myself, we could try to buy it together. Mm-hmm. And that I'm hoping to be able to continue to have access to him for advice and what to do in the future and when difficult situations arise, and I would do anything I could to help him and so on. So it's worked that way really well. So on the rare occasion I have something complicated emerge, I can say, hey, what would you do in this situation? and he's always been there for me in that regard. So I thought it was a really good training. I met a lot of the European colleagues that I do business with because I mostly sell European books. So I end up working a lot with people in France and Italy and England a little bit, Germany a little bit. And that background of working for Jonathan for 10 years really helped me in that.
So you left Jonathan Hill at what year?
1998.
1998. And are you still in New York? At that time, you were
At
still
that time, I was in New York. So I worked out of. At this point, I had 2 children, and I was living in Lower Manhattan on Murray Street between Greenwich and West Broadway, and on the 4th floor of an old concrete dairy building, actually. And so I turned the front part of the loft into my office, and that's where I wrote my first catalogs. Again, people would only visit me by appointment. Mm-hmm. And it was important to me when I chose gastronomy and set up. I made clear to my wife I'm not going to handle like thousands of secondhand books. I'm going to have a small but precious inventory. And I had to kind of pick a balance of where I could afford the reference library and I could also afford the inventory to get started. And I wanted to also have a sense that I could buy the great or greatest books in my field if in a reasonable amount of time in the development of the business. So there was a lot of elements. My mother had written a cookbook when I was growing up, so food was a big deal for me and my household. Had to pick a subject that I could be excited about when writing descriptions. And no one in the United States was doing early printed books in food and wine. So there were good people doing 1850 to 1950, but not the early material. And I already knew the who I'd be competing with in the auction room in Europe. There's like a guy named Hans Weiss who's in Zurich, and there were two people in Paris, Rémi Flachard and Alain Houchet. And then there were a couple people in Britain, but they were pretty much like Hans Weiss, kind of moving towards retirement age. So.
And now, so you started, this is 1998.
It's when the business started.
When your business started. And when did you move?
2003. So our home was the closest residential building to the north side of the World Trade Center.
Really?
So we were out of our home for 3 months. I had some damage to my inventory, and one of the engines was on our street and this kind of thing. So we were there when they tried to knock it down the first time, and it didn't succeed. So this was kind of, we'd had it. And the kids are fourth generation New Yorkers from my wife's side, so all of her family's there. And we knew at some point that we would leave New York and try living in the countryside in California, because we'd always come to California for vacation. And and on top of it, with some family, my son is in a wheelchair, and the construction downtown was really impossible.
Yeah.
For a long time. So we were like, this is crazy. We're getting out of here. So we ended up moving. We knew we would go, but it felt like we were leaving maybe 5 or 6 years before we had planned on leaving.
Yeah.
So we came to California, to Sonoma County, which is where my family was, and then we built a home on Pleasant Hill Road in Sebastopol, which was a beautiful contemporary home, and had a space for the book business, my wife's office, and everything the family needed. Then we decided that we wanted to actually live closer to town. It was very hard to make the adjustment to having to drive everywhere after having been in New York. So it seemed crazy. So, and ironically, the countryside around Sebastopol is not very well suited to pedestrians, even though everyone's really into ecology and being sportif and all this kind of stuff. But the fact is that you take your life into your hands just to walk 15 minutes down the road.
Yeah.
The roads are so narrow. So we moved into town just a couple years ago and bought a old house, well, for California, a 1906 house on a good-sized piece of property that's only 2 blocks from we're on Main Street, but we're 2 blocks from the center of town. And then during that interim period between selling the house on Pleasant Hill Road and looking for a new property, I opened up a public bookshop for the first time ever. Jonathan works privately from his home, so this was my first time having the experience of working at a public shop. I wanted to know what that would be like. I didn't think it would probably last too long, but I needed a place in between the homes at that point to work, and so I did that, and that was a good experience. I felt like with all of the digitization of texts that are occurring, that especially on the West Coast, there isn't that much opportunity for people to see early printed books and to have a better understanding of the book as an object. So I felt a little bit like, maybe it's a bit presumptuous, but it's something of a public service just to have this material for people to walk in off the street who don't know anything about books to see what they look like. So I did that for 3 years, and my lease is just about to expire. And it was a great experience. I was very productive. I had good years there, but it's tough to be open to the public all the time. It was very distracting also. And we finally bought this new property, which we have nearly 2 acres. And so we're now in the process of building a new shop on my property so that I can actually own the building instead of renting it.
Right.
So it's better for the family for the long term.
I remember when I was interviewing Doug Harding, I asked him, what is the most important thing that a bookseller can do? He said, own your own building.
Yeah, I can see that now. It's very smart. I mean, just for the ups and downs and the changes of the economy, and then it's your asset. And also it turned out that the landlord that we had at the current venue where I've got a shop, a public shop, turned out to be quite awful. And so I've kind of become the head of a tenant association, and we've got a lawyer and an auditor, and it takes so much time.
It's messy.
It is messy, and it's, yeah. So I've got that under construction. I've actually got at my booth right now, I just published it, a small book, printed letterpress by Pat Ray, that is about the bookshop that I'm about to close.
Oh.
So, because I wanted to document it, and it has a complete, the book itself is called Open by Chance and Appointment, which is what's on my
Okay.
door. And it's got photographs documenting the bookstore, and as well as a complete bibliography of all the publications we've issued as a bookstore. So.
Tell me a little bit about your internet experience. Are you on the net? What percentage of your inventory is on the net? What percentage of your business is created because there's an internet?
Well, I don't care for doing business on the internet.
Fine.
I do have a website with some of my inventory on it. I would say more than 50%, but not all. We do post our books. My assistant posts our books and puts them up onto the different websites. I would say I do certainly less than 5% of my business through the internet. I don't buy books myself through the internet. I might occasionally look to see what is out there just when trying to kind of get an idea of how rare something
Right.
is or what prices seem to be going at. The way I look at it, the future of antiquarian book selling will be much like it was in the past, which is to say that to cultivate a collector who's really committed and interested, I think that that collector needs a relationship with the bookseller or booksellers, both to kind of help learn how to voice what his or her interests are as collectors and kind of say, oh, no, I got this book, turns out I'm less interested in this part of it, but more interested in this subject, or just to have someone to have a dialogue with about collection development and about their interests. And the problem with the internet is the strength of the internet is its anonymity.
Yeah.
And the way that it sorts books automatically by price, as though they're all equal. And of course they're not, nor is the bookseller selling them. The booksellers aren't all equal. And in the beginning of the internet, which what I mean by that is, let's say, in around 2000 or something, when a lot of the books were going up onto the internet at such a rapid pace, I would, every few months, get contacted by somebody who had purchased a book where the bookseller had plagiarized my description. And they had figured out that the original description had come from my website or something that I had. And the problem is that then when they try to go after the person who, like, a good example is someone bought a book at, wasn't on Abe, where was it?
Hey, Libras?
No, maybe it was on eBay. And it was a book, a 3-volume book by Arthur Young. Arthur Young did these travels of England in different regions in the late 18th century, and he would talk about the sort of different farming practices. And they're interesting because they're written kind of from the viewpoint of like a farmer's perspective, but he would also talk about the foods that were being cultivated. He might even talk about the architecture. There's even one where he talks about the old master paintings in the 18th century in these farmhouses. It's quite an unusual and interesting guy. Anyhow, I had a 3-volume set of the first edition of one of these travels that he did in original calf, polished calf, and that my description had been used for something that someone had put on eBay. And when the guy ordered it and it came in, it was 1 volume instead of 3, and it was in Library Buckram.
Oh, great.
And he contacted me and said, I'd like you to join in a lawsuit with me to sue eBay. I was like, of course, I was like, I'm sorry, you're crazy, but
Yeah.
I'm sorry this happened, but there's this sort of thing happens all the time, and I can't be bothered with this. So, but my point is that there's a lot of buying and selling that can happen, it seems to me, that's on the internet, that because of the anonymity, you put yourself at risk. And imagine if you're a young collector, you don't need to be burned too many times to stop wanting to collect.
Right.
And if you're with a dealer, they're gonna hopefully, honestly and in a trustworthy way, teach you about your field, recommend these reference books. This is how you can learn about how bibliographies are written. This is how you can learn about the descriptions of books as objects and so on. And so I'm not so fond of the internet. Now, having said that, of course, I use it all the time for research. I use it all the time for email and so on. But in terms of actually commerce itself, I'm not a fan. I mean, I've gone quite the opposite direction. I published all of my catalogs are printed letterpress. I did flirt with it a little bit, the technology. According to Bill Barlow, I published the first bookseller catalog to exist in CD format only. And so I did try in the beginning, and that was a while ago now. And in those days, I had to go to 42nd Street, where all the sex shops were to find a guy who made DVDs in mass production.
Right.
And so I brought up my catalog on a bunch of floppy disks or whatever it was in those days, and then he made me a CD-ROM. But that was it. I got contacts from customers saying, "I read your catalogs when I'm sitting on the toilet. What am I supposed to do with a CD?" I'm not happy with the new technology. It's interesting, but I feel my customers like books as objects. I want to make a beautiful object when I make a catalog.
How many book fairs do you do on an average annually?
2 to 3.
Which ones are they?
New York, California, and usually Paris. I've also done Milan.
Did you do the Paris Photography Show?
No. The problem that, of course, happened with Paris is when they moved from Mutualité to the Grand Palais, it's a pain in the butt to get there from New York. I mean, at one point, they did one fair, there was only a week in between them. Yeah. Now I think there's like maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks. It's really tough. And
it is.
And I know Michel Bouvier, who helps to organize the placement of the fair, and they like it because a lot more rich folk live near the Grand Palais and go to that area, and they get a better attendance level. But the Grand Palais is not available in the usual, month of May when they would used to do the book fair. So
it's so similar to what's going to happen in New York. We're set for 2016, but apparently that's going to be the last one.
At the Park Avenue Armory. Yeah. They're just so overwhelmed with people who want to attend, I think, right? With booths, I mean. They don't have enough booths, right?
Well, it's not that they don't have enough booths. It's that the government is turning, or whatever, whoever owns that building, is turning it into a performance arts center.
Oh, yeah. They've been doing these contemporary art exhibitions. They've been getting a lot of money.
And that's going to be their main thrust, and they want us out.
Yeah, interesting.
So right now the New York Book Fair Committee is struggling, trying to figure out where the hell they're going to go.
Yeah. Well, I hope it's not the Javits Center. I did that fair when that happened.
I heard that the Javits Center was just so way away from everything that people didn't come.
It's also the union situation at the Javits Center was actually worse than at the Armory.
That's hard to believe.
I know, it is hard to believe. But at least at the Armory, once you figure out the guys and how they want things done, and you do it that way, it goes pretty smoothly.
Oh, wow.
Javits Center is huge.
Yeah.
And so there's really a feeling of like distance from anything. Yeah.
It's the kind of world we live in now, when we used to have 1 or 2 book fairs a year, and maybe you had 40 exhibitors. And nowadays, my God, it's too much.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
Too many book fairs, but that's the business that we're living in right now, and we're going to have to adjust ourselves to it. What do you see as some of the great challenges that we're going to be facing as booksellers in the next decade?
So it's interesting. Each country is different. In Europe, there's far more younger booksellers coming up through the ranks.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Than in the United States. And yet the Europeans are feeling very dependent upon the American market for selling, which is interesting. I think that, I belong to so I'm 52, and I belong to a dinner group that Barney Rosenthal first started in the Bay Area. We meet once a month on the first Wednesday, or we're supposed to. Sometimes it moves, but. And as a person who's 52, I'm the young guy in the group.
I would imagine you would be.
So I wonder about in 20 years from now what it's going to be. So I think that there's the book selling side. I think we need to certainly encourage and cultivate relationships and mentorships with employees. And I think also, though, of course, I'm sure almost all booksellers have always said this, we need more younger customers. And but I think that is hard to do through internet sales. So this is why
Right.
it's important to try to encourage the younger customers that we have. I always tell my customers, and I really genuinely firmly believe this, that you can collect something serious with any budget
Yeah.
and make a contribution to that area. And then it might be something which, when you start out collecting it, costs $50 a pop or whatever. But if you take it seriously and wrap your head around it and put together a solid collection, you could even do a bibliography potentially about it, and you've made a contribution. And it's much more interesting to do that than to do a greats collection or something. So I feel like the younger customers, or the customers who don't have as much money or resources, I think they need to hear that and they need to know about that. Meet others like themselves. I used to be a Groyer Club member, and it meant a lot to me when I was in New York because I used the library a lot for research.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, quite honestly, there were so few young people at the club that I felt like the odd man out. And so I think we need to be really conscious of the importance, of course, I mean, I'm sure everyone's saying this, but we really do need to be conscious of the importance of encouraging, the younger generation. And I actually think, and this is partly why I had done my bookstore, I actually think that what will emerge as things become more digitized and people have more and more electronic experiences with text, I actually believe that for some it will create an even more pleasurable experience with holding the book as an object. And so I think we just need to ride this out, and I think that things will be okay. I'm not saying it will be on the same level as before, and it certainly will be different, but I do think that there will emerge, and is already emerging, a generation where they're touching the early printed material and saying, this is incredible. I've never seen anything like it.